Have you been following Sophie Cunningham and what's happened? I know you're a big sports fan, the WNBA. She's been targeted, elbowed for her beliefs. I mean, she basically believes girls' sports should be protected. I was a college athlete, and this is an issue near and dear to my heart and so many women across the country.
Yeah, of course.
Your reaction to what's happened to her?
Well, I just think, look, sometimes when you're courageous in this country, some of the worst people in the world try to attack you. What I would tell Sophie and anybody else is keep speaking your mind. You actually are inspiring a dozen people for every person that criticizes you. And we cannot take our country back. We cannot save the United States of America unless you have people of courage.
Some sports stories disappear before the final buzzer, but this one somehow sprinted straight into the middle of America's loudest argument. Sophie Cunningham said exactly what millions were already fighting about. And then JD Vance showed up with a megaphone instead of a fire extinguisher. Suddenly, basketball looked less like a game and more like Thanksgiving dinner after someone mentions politics. The backlash, the applause, and the reactions were absolutely wild. And the craziest part is what happened next.
Look at your screen. A French trans player says if the WNBA gives them a chance to play in the league, they would not turn down an offer. I'd like to now go to my co-anchor for the day who actually played women's basketball.
A major cultural rift has erupted within the WNBA following comments by Indiana Fever guard Sophie Cunningham opposing the inclusion of biological male athletes who identify as, quote, transgender.
Somewhere in a small Missouri gym, a girl who spent her childhood getting knocked around by her older brothers on the driveway hoop probably never pictured a future where the Vice President of the United States would go on national television to defend her honor.
We came out of Seattle, and where Storm minority owner Celeste Keaton was suspended 5 home games after confronting 2 teenage fans during a game. The girls were holding signs supporting Sophie Cunningham following her comments about transgender participation in women's sports, and the WNBA ruled that the interaction violated its fan code of conduct, the Storm issuing an apology for the incident afterwards. Sophie, without sort of revisiting the actual issue that brought us to this point, I would just love if to get your thoughts on the league's discipline of an owner over a fan interaction.
Yeah, I think I have a very clear and strong...
Yet that is exactly the position Sophie Cunningham found herself in this week. And the strangest part of the story is how little of it actually involves basketball. For most of her career, Cunningham built her reputation the old-fashioned way, through elbows, hustle plays, and a willingness to get physical in a league that increasingly rewards finesse over force.
The point here is not that this is demeaning to women's sports. It's that the only reason women's sports exist is because men don't play them. Because otherwise you would have a unisex league and no women would be able to play. So when I get attacked like this, by the way, there's a couple of other funny clips. Did you see the clip of the French woman? Producer Ali, I'm going to give you one of the
We got to be clear here. The Frenchman. It's a Frenchman. It's a French dude. Okay?
That is a bad bitch if I've ever seen one on the basketball court.
She was never the player fans circled on the schedule for her scoring average, which has always hovered in the modest role player range. She was the player fans circled because if you crossed one of her teammates, she was going to make you regret it.
I want to ask you a specific question, because the one thing you didn't mention in the things that would be easy to just say no to, right? Or agree with. In this big Sophie Cunningham story, for example, she writes a ESPN feature saying she doesn't agree with allowing transgender girls and women to compete in women's sports. And all hell breaks loose with this. And I don't understand why. And perhaps you can explain to me what is wrong with what she said. Because she's right.
And nothing proved that faster than the night in June of last year when a referee missed an obvious eye poke on Caitlin Clark, and Cunningham responded by taking the offending player to the floor like she was auditioning for a different sport entirely. The clip spread everywhere within hours, turning a backup guard into a folk hero overnight, and giving her a brand that had almost nothing to do with her shooting percentage. That single moment did more for her profile than 3 seasons of quiet, competent basketball ever could. And by the time the dust settled, Cunningham had somehow outsearched Clark herself on Google's year-end rankings, a fact that says as much about the modern sports internet as it does about either player. It was around this same stretch that a nickname started following her everywhere, MAGA Barbie, a label that first showed up during her college years, resurfaced once she became a household name alongside Clark, and stuck despite her repeated insistence that it was a lazy shorthand for a political identity she never claimed. She told the New York Times last year that people made assumptions about her because of where she grew up and what she looked like, and that in reality, she considered herself somewhere in the middle. It was a fair enough defense at the time, and for a while it mostly worked, because Cunningham was still, first and foremost, a basketball story. That framing held up right until an ESPN profile published last month asked her directly about the nickname, and her answer changed the entire trajectory of her year.
The WNBA is more misogynistic and is more chauvinistic than Andrew Tate.
Mm-hmm.
You got it. I said it. You know why? Because the WNBA, two coaches, one of them being Caitlin Clark's coach, the other one being a coach that they just went up against, they were having a game, and at this game, she decides to wear a shirt at the game playing against Sophie Cunningham. After Sophie made the comments about transgender, she wears the shirt if he can show it on the sidelines.
Cunningham did not dodge the question. She said she had absorbed plenty of criticism over the idea that she hated transgender people, and she rejected that characterization outright, insisting that what she actually believed in was love paired with honesty. Then she said the part that mattered, that she wanted young girls to be able to compete and change in locker rooms without having to go against biological men. It was a short answer, delivered without much fanfare, buried in a profile that was ostensibly about her career, and it detonated instantly across a league and a country that had already been arguing about this exact question for years. This was not a new debate she was stepping into. Women's sports had been the battleground for this fight at nearly every level, from state high school leagues to Olympic qualifying for the better part of a decade, with swimmers, track athletes, and volleyball players all taking turns at the center of the argument before it ever reached a WNBA roster. The response inside the WNBA was immediate and uneven. Some teammates and rivals stayed quiet, unwilling to wade into a topic that had already ended careers and friendships elsewhere.
The thing about courage, Laura, is it's contagious. When you see one person, even if they have the mob come after them, one person speak their mind in a courageous and honest way, it inspires a lot of people to do the same. So I would tell Sophie, keep going.
And during this weekend, in a game against the Indiana Fever, she was seen wearing a Trans Kid Belong t-shirt. I'm going to repeat that. Trans Kid Belong t-shirt on Sunday during the game.
Others made clear in interviews and on social media that they were uncomfortable sharing a locker room, physically or symbolically, with a colleague who had just staked out a public position on one of the most contentious issues in American sports. Crowds that once cheered Cunningham for her toughness started booing her the moment she checked into road games, turning what used to be a routine substitution into a small spectacle every single time. The applause she had earned for throwing her body around in defense of a teammate suddenly arrived with an asterisk attached to it, and highlight reels that once celebrated her got recut into something closer to a referendum. Then the story left the arena entirely and became something closer to a political flashpoint, and the escalation happened fast. Two teenage fans showed up wearing shirts printed with chromosome symbols while holding handmade signs thanking Cunningham for speaking up on their behalf. What should have been a minor pregame moment, the kind of thing that usually lives and dies in a single crowd photo, turned into a genuine controversy when Seattle Storm co-owner Celeste Keaton approached the girls and, according to multiple reports, cursed at them, leaving one of them in tears before security intervened.
You know, trans kids, this is it right here. That's the coach. Trans kids belong. They had a conversation together. They walked up to each other. They had the talk. And by the way, just so you know, we did not know this. I Googled to see which side Cheryl Reeve is on. She's actually a lesbian. Nothing wrong with that. But they're having a conversation here to the left. That's Sophie and her talking. Then the post-game interview, she's being interviewed, the coach, and the question is asked. And here's what the coach had to say of the opposing team. If you can go to what the coach had to say of the opposing team in the post-game.
The WNBA suspended and fined Keaton over the incident, and Cunningham fired back on social media, calling the co-owner's behavior truly embarrassing, while insisting once again that she held love in her heart for everyone at the table, biological women and trans people included, even as she stood firmly by the position that had started the entire firestorm in the first place. By this point, the Indiana Fever organization had clearly seen enough of the spotlight. Reporters trying to ask Cunningham follow-up questions found press conferences cut short or shut down altogether. And the team, already navigating a rough patch that included a tough loss to the Lynx, tried visibly to wall off its locker room from a conversation that had grown far bigger than any single roster could contain. That containment strategy might have worked for an ordinary controversy, the kind that fades once the next game tips off. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt was first out of the gate, telling reporters that President Trump was tracking the situation closely and that his position on the underlying issue, that men should not be playing in women's sports, was one he felt strongly about alongside a large share of the public. She went further, framing the backlash against Cunningham as evidence that her critics had lost touch with mainstream opinion entirely, a talking point clearly designed to travel well beyond a single press briefing. It was a notable statement on its own, but it also turned out to be a preview, because the man who actually holds the second highest office in the country was about to make the whole thing personal.
They call it the wokest league out here, the woke NBA. The WNBA is, Sophie Cunningham is clearly the one who's speaking her mind. People are supporting her, protesting on her behalf. She doesn't think men should be able to play with women in sports. And believe it or not, this is causing a bit of a problem in the WNBA as coaches support trans, fellow students, fellow players.
J.D. Vance's involvement in this fight did not start with Cunningham. He had already been one of the driving forces behind Executive Order 14,201, the policy known informally as keeping men out of women's sports, signed within days of taking office alongside President Trump and positioned from the start as one of the defining cultural priorities of the new administration. He was returning to a subject he had already staked a considerable piece of his political career on, and he used the moment to speak to her directly, telling her to keep speaking her mind because she was, in his own words, inspiring a dozen people for every person that criticizes you. He framed her willingness to absorb the criticism as a form of civic courage, the exact kind he argued the country desperately needs if it hopes to hold on to its values. And he warned that speaking out this plainly tends to invite the harshest possible reaction from certain corners of the public. Comments that were clipped, captioned, and circulating across every major platform within the hour. Conservative commentators treated Vance's comments as validation, proof that the fight Cunningham had picked was worth having, and that she now had serious institutional backing behind her.
In an interview with ESPN, Cunningham said, "I want to protect young girls in a locker room or young girls in sport who shouldn't have to go against biological men." Cunningham defended her stance as common sense, adding, "There are rights that need to be protected." The issue has polarized fans and figures across the league, sparking both protests and counter rallies outside games. The situation has even sparked intense national debate over inclusion, fairness, and the core identity of women's sports.
Supportive fans pointed to the moment as evidence that speaking out carries real protection at the highest levels of government. Critics on the other side treated it as something closer to absurd, with more than one columnist arguing it was faintly ridiculous for a sitting vice president, in the middle of managing genuine foreign policy crises, to spend national airtime defending the media strategy of a reserve guard on a mid-tier WNBA roster. Both reactions, in their own strange way, prove the exact same underlying point, which is that Cunningham's ESPN answer had stopped being a basketball story a long time before Vance ever opened his mouth about it. What made the whole episode even more interesting was how the athletes closest to it actually responded, because none of them reached for the temperature Vance had just set. Caitlin Clark, asked directly about her teammate's stance, sidestepped the political minefield with practiced ease, essentially saying this was not a conversation happening inside the Fever's own locker room, and that the real work belonged to leagues and governing bodies rather than to players trading opinions through the media. It was a masterclass in staying out of the blast radius, and it stood in sharp contrast to Cunningham, who had walked directly into the middle of it and showed no real interest in walking back out, even as the temperature around her kept climbing by the day.
Okay, I'll answer that, but I want to address the previous point here, because one of these things about even candidates like Trump vexes the Republican Party establishment. Now he is the Republican Party establishment, but vexed them at the time. He vexes the Democratic Party establishment, so does DSA. A big part of the reason that these candidates are rising and doing better is because the system isn't working for people, so they're willing to take bigger risks. Like a system that will elect Donald Trump, who I don't believe on any level is qualified to be president of the United States, who has already proven himself to be so corrupt even before his second term, is a system that's crying out for help.
That says far less about her talent level than it does about where American sports currently sit in relation to American politics, which is to say, directly on top of each other, with almost no separation left between the two. Ballot initiatives like the ones on the table in Washington state are multiplying across the country. An executive order on the exact subject is already federal policy, and athletes at every level are discovering that a single honest answer in a magazine profile can now travel further and faster than an entire season of box scores ever could. Now she can end up in the same headline as a sitting vice president before halftime of a Tuesday night game against Seattle, which is either an inspiring story about the power of speaking honestly or a slightly alarming one about how little separation is left between the scoreboard and the news cycle, depending entirely on who you ask. Whatever anyone ultimately believes about the underlying policy question, and plenty of thoughtful, well-meaning people land on sharply opposite sides of it, the Cunningham story reveals something larger about the moment sports currently occupies in American life.
With that being said, though, I think I know that people are not always going to align and agree. I totally understand that. But I think the most important thing is of having that respect, having that love, and pursuing peace in these conversations, in these debates, because I think that is healthy. Now, with that being said, I just hate how the basketball of it all is just getting overshadowed. I think that you are seeing teams playing at the highest level they've ever played at. You see great basketball, the most elite level basketball this league has ever seen.
Visibility now arrives bundled with exposure, and athletes willing to speak plainly on the country's most divisive issues are discovering that the backing of a vice president and the fury of an entire fan base can show up in the very same news cycle, sometimes within the very same afternoon. It is a trade that used to be optional for professional athletes, something reserved for the rare few who actively sought out a political platform. Cunningham never seemed to be chasing one. Sophie Cunningham did not set out to become a symbol in a national argument over who gets to compete in women's sports. She set out to defend a teammate against a missed call on a random night in June. Somewhere between that tackle and this week's headlines, the story stopped being about basketball altogether. And at this point, it is genuinely unclear whether it is ever going back, or whether Cunningham herself has any interest in letting it.